going to be doing, because I do not have my usual co-host Flo Trace here with me. I got to stream solo today. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be watching videos about Bertrand Russell. For all I know, he might be in the videos. He was alive during a time when when videos could have been recorded of him. But I'm going to see what these are all about, and I'm going to be reacting to them. And so this is kind of a new experiment for me, but we'll see how it goes. So here it is.
The subject about which I am going to speak to you tonight is why I am not a Christian. Perhaps it would be as well, first of all, to try to make out what one means by the word Christian. It is used these days in a very loose sense by a great many people.
All right, I've already got reactions to this. Oh man, Christians don't even agree on what is a Christian, but I like that he's at least starting out by trying to disambiguate what he's arguing for and what he's arguing against. Um, I, I'm sure we've all seen a million Twitch debates devolve into arguments over definitions, and I don't think I think that's too much of that is bad, but I think a little bit of it is good. I think this is going to help us understand what the hell he's talking about. It would be uh, probably a mistake for him to just immediately start arguing for something without telling us exactly what it is, and particularly with something like Christian, with which people do not agree very much with one another on what it is. So here we go.
Some people mean no more by it than a person who attempts to live a good life. In that sense, I suppose there would be Christians in all sects and creeds, but I do not think that that is the proper sense of the word, if only because it would imply that all the people who are not Christians, all the Buddhists, Confucians, Mohammedans, and so on, are not trying to live a good life. I do not mean by a Christian any person who tries to live decently according to his lights. I think that you must have a certain amount of definite belief before you have a right to call yourself a Christian. The word does not have quite such a full-blooded meaning now as it had in the times of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. In those days, if a man said that he was a Christian, it was known what he meant. You accepted a whole collection of creeds which were set out with great precision, and every single syllable of those creeds you believed with the whole strength of your convictions. What is a Christian? Nowadays it is not quite that. We have to be a little more vague in our meaning of Christianity. I think, however, that there are two different items which are quite essential to anybody calling himself a Christian. The first is one of a dogmatic nature, namely, that you must believe in God and immortality. If you do not believe in those two things, I do not think that you can properly call yourself a Christian. Then, further than that, as the name implies, you must have some kind of belief about Christ. The Mohammedans, for instance, also believe in God and in immortality, and yet they would not call themselves Christians. I think you must have, at the very lowest, the belief that Christ was, if not divine, at least the best and wisest of men.
It's pretty interesting to me to hear him talking about. Oh man, hey, this Tariq saying we aren't called Mohammedans. Um, yeah, I understand that in the present day we typically wouldn't say that. This was recorded in 1927. I think it was pretty common back then. Um, but yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting for him to talk about the way that the term Christian was used back then, not to just mean someone like a religious person who believes in Christianity literally, but also just to mean an upstanding moral person. And yeah, I don't know if it's really ever used that way anymore. I'm old enough that I have some recollection of this being used that in decades past to mean an upstanding moral person, because Christian society back then pretty much just equated Christianity with morality. Um, but I like that, since he was living in a time and place when people were using the word that way. I'm glad that he yeah, Tariq. Yeah, he just means you're a good person in some sense. Or I'm sorry. He's clarifying that he doesn't mean that he's just talking about a good person, right? What he's saying is that uh oh gosh, Buckle's calling me a good Christian man. Okay. Uh Bertrand Russell's clarifying here that what he's arguing against is not morality or in or Christianity in the sense of just being a good person. He's arguing specifically against the supernatural religious beliefs. So he's going to say you have to believe in God, you have to believe in immortality, and you have to look at Christ as the way he put it was a little bit bad in one of those sentences because he said you have to have some kind of belief in Christ, and then he's using this to exclude Muslims who do in fact have some kind of a belief in Christ, but apparently the way he clarified it afterwards, you have to believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, something like that. I wish I could remember the exact words that he used, but um, so that's what he's going to be arguing against, or at least explaining why he doesn't believe that.
I'm not going to believe that much about Christ. I do not think you have any right to call yourself a Christian. Of course, there is another sense, which you find in Whitaker's Almanac and in geography books, where the population of the world is said to be divided into Christians, Mohammedans, Buddhists, fetish worshippers, and so on. And in that sense, we are all Christians. The geography books count us all in, but that is a purely geographical sense, which I suppose we can ignore. Therefore, I take it that when I tell you why I am not a Christian, I have to tell you two different things. First, why I do not believe in God and in immortality, and secondly, why I do not think that Christ was the best and wisest of men, although I grant him a very high degree of moral goodness. The existence of God. To come to this question of the existence of God, it is a large and serious question, and if I were to attempt to deal with it in any adequate manner, I should have to keep you here until Kingdom Come, so that you will have to excuse me if I deal with it in a somewhat summary fashion. You know
Oh man, Bertrand Russell going with the memes, keeping us here until Kingdom Come. But this is only a 35-minute video, so of course, if you guys are familiar with all the arguments about the existence of God, you will know that he's not kidding. You really could just argue about this stuff for days and days and days on end. Um, so yeah, it makes total sense that he's just going to have to give a quick summary.
that the Catholic Church has laid it down as a dogma that the existence of God can be proved by the unaided reason. That is a somewhat curious dogma, but it is one of their dogmas. They had to introduce it because at one time the free-thinkers adopted the habit of saying that there were such and such arguments which mere reason might urge against the existence of God, but of course they knew as a matter of faith that God did exist. The arguments and the reasons were set out at great length, and the Catholic Church felt that they must stop it. Therefore they laid it down that the existence of God can be proved by the unaided reason, and they had to set up what they considered were arguments to prove it. There are, of course, a number of them, but I shall take only a few.
This is a slightly weird way that he's going about this. So it sounds um, like he's going to start out not by arguing against the existence of God, but instead by responding to arguments for the existence of God. I think that would be a fine thing to do in a debate about those arguments, but he's just leading with that, which I don't really like. I would prefer for him to just give arguments against the existence of God, and then since he doesn't have anyone here making the arguments in favor to him. Yeah, Tariq, he was an atheist before atheism became cool. He kind of was. Yeah, he's the inspiration for a lot of um I don't know, a lot of modern philosophical thought. He was really into like math and logic and all this kind of stuff. Um, all right. Well, let's hear what he's got to say about the Catholic Church's arguments for God.
The first cause argument. Perhaps the simplest and easiest to understand is the argument of the first cause. It is maintained that everything we see in this world has a cause, and as you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause, and to that first cause you give the name of God.
Yeah, anybody who's had a bunch of debates over the existence of God will have heard this one a million times. Yeah, so this one, um, there's a popular version of it due to Saint Thomas Aquinas, which is worded almost exactly the way that Russell just delivered it. If you hear people debate this today, they will a lot of times go with the Kalam cosmological argument, they'll call it, which is like everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and then they go on to equate that cause with God. So yeah, this one's very familiar with it. There's a lot of different ways to come at it.
That argument, I suppose, does not carry very much weight nowadays, because, in the first place, cause is not quite what it used to be. The philosophers and the men of science have got going on cause, and it is not anything like the vitality it used to have. But apart from that, you can see
I love it. He's attacking causality. This is a thing that's near and dear to my heart. So I have I guess what's kind of an unpopular opinion as far as I can tell around Twitch politics, but not that we spend a whole lot of time talking about philosophy or anything, but I do not believe in causality. I'm on the same side with, well, I guess that Bertrand Russell hasn't necessarily said that this is his own opinion, but yeah, I think that this is it's kind of just an antiquated, simplistic way of looking at the world. And so I don't know. It touched my heart a little bit to hear him start off by attacking causality.
the argument that there must be a first cause is one that cannot have any validity. I may say that when I was a young man, and was debating these questions very seriously in my mind, I for a long time accepted the argument of the first cause, until one day, at the age of 18, I read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence: "My father taught me that the question, 'Who made me?' cannot be answered, since it immediately suggests the further question, 'Who made God?'" That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of the first cause.
Hmm. I actually don't find that line of reasoning very persuasive. Like you could say that it's true that that if you think humans require an explanation or require a maker, that you can then go on and ask who made God. Um, that I don't think that that's actually a persuasive reason to believe that humans were not created by a god. Although I myself am an atheist, I do not believe that humans were created by a god. But just the simple fact that you can ask who made God, um, I do think you could turn this into a more persuasive argument by going into more depth about it. But obviously, he's not going to do that here. He's just giving a quick overview of why he doesn't believe in a god. But the mere fact that you can ask that question, it isn't really a very strong argument, in my opinion.
If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause.
Oh yeah, there it goes. So if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. Um. So I mean, there's a lot of ways around this for a religious person. Like that, like they can say like everything except God must have a cause, and that's special pleading and stuff. But they can just make the argument that way. Um, obviously any version of this argument is going to require them to assert some things that I don't believe. So I don't want to be too uncharitable about it. But um, I don't know. There's another problem with this everything must have a cause, but because it's phrased in the singular, like as in everything must have one cause. But I don't see why that would necessarily have to be the case. Like why can't something have several causes, and then the several causes can have several more? This is assuming you believe in causality in the first place. Um, yeah, I don't know. Let's continue.
If there can be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God, so that there cannot be any validity in that argument. It is exactly of the same nature as the Hindus' view that the world rested upon an elephant, and the elephant rested upon a tortoise, and when they said, "How about the tortoise?" the Indian said, "Suppose we change the subject." The argument is really no better than that. There is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause, nor, on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea
Um, well, this is obviously pretty relevant to a lot of stuff that has happened since 1927. Um, the world did have a beginning. We're pretty confident about that one. Now, if he wants to say the world in the sense of like the universe, that's a little more complicated question. So I have a physics background. I took a whole bunch of astrophysics and cosmology classes. So when I say that it's a complicated question, I don't necessarily mean that whether the Big Bang happened or not is a complicated question. It's complicated to learn about it, but the answer is simple. As far as the best evidence indicates, the Big Bang did happen. Now, whether that's actually the beginning of the universe is a separate question. It may or may not be, right? So it could be that the Big Bang is the beginning of time and the beginning of the universe, or it could be that it's just a thing that happened within the timeline that spawned the universe. We really just don't know. So when he says this stuff about that the world may not have had a beginning, I think that's on shakier ground today than it was when he first said it.
things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps I need not waste any more time upon the argument about the first cause. The natural law argument. Then there is a very common argument from natural law. That was a favourite argument all through the 18th century, especially under the influence of Sir Isaac Newton and his cosmogony. People observed the planets going around the sun according to the law of gravitation, and they thought that God had given a behest to these planets to move in that particular fashion, and that was why they did so. That was, of course, a convenient and simple explanation that saved them the trouble of looking any further for explanations of the law of gravitation. But nowadays we explain the law of gravitation in a somewhat complicated fashion that Einstein has introduced. I do not propose to give you a lecture on the law of gravitation as interpreted by Einstein, because that again would take some time. At any rate, you no longer have the sort of natural law that you had in the Newtonian system, where, for some reason that nobody could understand, nature behaved in a uniform fashion. We now find that a great many things we thought were natural laws are really human conventions. You know that even in the remotest depths of stellar space there are still 3 feet to a yard. That is no doubt a very remarkable fact, but you would hardly call it a law of nature. And a great many things that have been regarded as laws of nature are of that kind. On the other hand, where you can get down to any knowledge of what atoms actually do, you will find they are much less subject to law than people thought, and that the laws at which you arrive are statistical averages of just the sort that would emerge from chance. There is, as we all know, a law that if you throw dice, you will get double sixes only about once in 36 times, and we do not regard that as evidence that the fall of the dice is regulated by design.
Interestingly enough, I think some people probably would look at that as evidence that the fall of the dice is regulated by design. And in fact, I think I might even believe that because the dice are made by people who intended that outcome. So I don't know. I think that's kind of a poor argument there. Um, but anyway, this argument that he's giving now. This is really similar to the teleological argument, which you will hear people use to talk about how I mean, it's an argument from design, right? So I haven't heard it phrased exactly this way before, like that it's an argument about natural law, but I've instead heard it phrased like why is it that the universe has these basic properties that it has? Sometimes people will characterize that as it's fine tuned for the existence of human life. Um, Sometimes people will put it as like why is there order instead of chaos, why is there something instead of nothing, and attribute that kind of a thing to a god, believing that kind of thing could only have come from a mind, or at least that a mind is the best explanation for such a thing. But let's see what he's got to say about it.
On the contrary, if the double sixes came every time, we should think that there was design. The laws of nature are of that sort as regards a great many of them. They are statistical averages, such as would emerge from the laws of chance, and that makes this whole business of natural law much less impressive than it formerly was.
Yeah, I don't really agree with him on this. I think you could have outcomes that are the result of chance, but nevertheless, like games of chance have rules to them, and if you believe in a god, presumably you believe that God is setting up those rules.
Quite apart from that, which represents the momentary state of science that may change tomorrow, the whole idea that natural laws imply a lawgiver is due to a confusion between natural and human laws. Human laws are behests commanding you to behave a certain way, in which way you may choose to behave or you may choose not to behave. But natural laws are a description of how things do in fact behave. And being a mere description of what they in fact do, you cannot argue that there must be somebody who told them to do that. Because even supposing that there were, you are then faced with the question, why did God issue just those natural laws and no others?
I really like that he made the point about how the natural laws, as he calls them, are descriptive rather than prescriptive. I think a lot of people do get the wrong idea when they hear phrases like the laws of physics, as if these are like rules that objects have to follow rather than descriptions of the behaviors uh, of well, I shouldn't even say objects necessarily. I mean, physics is, you know, the behavior of matter and energy, right? But it's descriptions of those behaviors rather than rules that those things have to follow.
And if you say that he did it simply from his own good pleasure and without any reason, you then find that there is something which is not subject to law, and so your train of natural law is interrupted. If you say,
That's a weird argument to make. He's saying that the train of natural law is interrupted, but if you suppose the existence of a god being responsible for it, um, but I think that's exactly the point, right? If you do believe in a god, you are intending to interrupt that train of logic with God. You're attempting to set up an exception to all these rules and saying that God is the source of all these rules as opposed to another thing that has to follow all these rules, right? So in a way, this could undercut uh, if you were to start out by making this argument that everything has to follow natural laws, you would then be undercutting that argument by later saying that God it doesn't have to follow those laws. So if that's the point that he's making, it makes sense. Um, but I think just the mere fact that theists believe God is an exception to those laws isn't. I don't know. It doesn't um, I suppose it's noteworthy, but it's not something that necessarily must be true or false logically.
as more orthodox theologians do, that in all the laws which God issues, he had a reason for giving those laws rather than others, the reason, of course, being to create the best universe, although you would never think it to look at it. If there were a reason for the laws which God gave, then God himself was subject to law, and therefore you do not get any advantage by introducing God as an intermediary.
Um, yeah, this one I've got mixed feelings about. The idea that if God has any reasons for doing what he does, then therefore he's subject to those reasons. Um, because I think most theists believe that he does have reasons, but he is also the source of those reasons, so he's not subject to them. Um, so now, if you do believe that, then in some sense you do believe that that all of God's decisions are arbitrary. He didn't have reasons outside of himself uh, to do those things, and so on those grounds, I think that there is a little bit of merit to the argument that Russell is making here. Um, that basically, like whatever laws, whatever rules, whatever goals that God has are just things that He made up, and therefore, um, I suppose you could just take the question back one more step. It's like why did he make those goals the way he did, and so on. And you could try to turn this into some kind of claim about an infinite regress. Um, I don't know. I suppose, like, if you are religious, I don't see why you couldn't just believe that there is an infinite regress here. If because if you're believing in a God, then presumably you're believing that God has the ability to have infinitely many reasons for things, and that he doesn't need to be subject to all the same kind of strictures of logic that any human would have in thinking out their reasons for making a decision. Um, Nevertheless, like, if you do believe that, then you would have to believe that God is kind of incomprehensible. You couldn't then go around really trying to describe what God's reasons are, even though it's very common for religious people to think they know what God's reasons are. Um, all right, let's continue.
A law outside and anterior to the divine edicts, and God does not serve your purpose because he is not the ultimate lawgiver. In short, this whole argument about natural law no longer has anything like the strength that it used to have. I am travelling on in time in my review of the arguments. The arguments that are used for the existence of God change their character as time goes on. They were at first hard intellectual arguments embodying certain quite definite fallacies. As we come to modern times, they become less respectable intellectually and more affected by a kind of moralizing vagueness. The argument from design.
Oh, okay. This is interesting that he classifies this as a separate argument from the natural law thing. Um, I I would have thought that those two could be lumped together into a single category, but apparently Bertrand Russell did not think so.
The next step in this process brings us to the argument from design. You all know the argument from design. Everything in the world is made just so that we can manage to live in the world. And if the world was ever so little different, we could not manage to live in it. That is the argument from design. It sometimes takes a rather curious form. For instance, it is argued that rabbits have white tails in order to be easy to shoot. I do not know how rabbits would view that application. It is an easy argument to parody. You all know Voltaire's remark that obviously the nose was designed to be such as to fit spectacles. That sort of parody has turned out to be not nearly so wide of the mark as it might have seemed in the 18th century, because since the time of Darwin we understand much better why living creatures are adapted to their environment. It is not that their environment was made to be suitable to them, but that they grew to be suitable to it, and that is the basis of adaptation. There is no evidence of design about it. When you come to look into this argument from design, it is a most astonishing thing that people can believe that this world, with all the things that are in it, with all its defects, should be the best that omnipotence and omniscience have been able to produce in millions of years. I really cannot believe it. Do you think that If you were granted omnipotence and omniscience, and millions of years in which to perfect your world, you could produce nothing better than the Ku Klux Klan or the fascists. Moreover, if you accept the ordinary laws of science, you have to suppose that human life and life in general on this planet will die out in due course. It is a state.
He's kind of almost like presenting the problem of evil here. The idea being that if God is so benevolent, then why does he allow bad things to exist in the world? Um, so I don't know. I mean this is definitely applicable to some theists. If they really believe that the world was designed to be the best possible world, then they would then have to believe that it's the best according to God's standard and not to ours. I think I don't know that anyone would say that our world is the best possible world by some standard other than that. I mean, maybe you could find someone who would, but or if they think there is only one possible world or something like that. Um, but then it wouldn't mean anything to say that it's the best. The way I've heard theists respond to this typically is by just saying that God has such great wisdom and a wise divine plan that he actually understands why this world really is the best according to to his infinite wisdom and that all the things that appear to be defects to us are actually working exactly as intended. Um, which is I don't know. I mean there's a whole line of argumentation back and forth about that. Obviously, like I'm not persuaded by any of these arguments for the existence of God. So you know maybe I'm being a little bit harsh on Russell here, but you know because he's just giving a surface level overview of what a few of the most popular arguments are and just a really quick response to them. And I think his responses are mostly pointing in the right direction.
Stage in the decay of the solar system. At a certain stage of decay, you get the sort of conditions of temperature and so forth which are suitable to protoplasm, and there is life for a short time in the life of the whole solar system. You see in the moon the sort of thing to which the Earth is tending, something dead, cold, and lifeless. I am told that that sort of view is depressing, and people will sometimes tell you that if they believed that, they would not be able to go on living. Do not believe it. It is all nonsense. Nobody really worries much about what is going to happen millions of years hence. Even if they think they are worrying much about that, they are really deceiving themselves. They are worried about something much more mundane, or it may merely be a bad digestion. But nobody is really seriously rendered unhappy by the thought of something that is going to happen to this world millions and millions of years hence. Therefore, although it is a
I don't think that's true. That nobody can be unhappy about something that's going to happen millions of years in the future. I think I've sometimes been unhappy thinking about that. Um, yeah,
of course, a gloomy view to suppose that life will die out. At least I suppose we may say so, although sometimes when I contemplate the things that people do with their lives, I think it is almost a consolation. It is not such as to render life miserable. It merely makes you turn your attention to other things. The moral arguments for deity. Now we reach one stage further in what I shall call the intellectual descent that the theists have made in their argumentations, and we come to what are called the moral arguments for the existence of God. You all know, of course, that there used to be in the old days 3 intellectual arguments for the existence of God, all of which were disposed of by Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. But no sooner had he disposed of those arguments than he invented a new one, a moral argument, and that quite convinced him. He was like many people. In intellectual matters he was sceptical, but in moral matters he believed implicitly in the maxims that he had imbibed at his mother's knee. That illustrates what the psychoanalysts so much emphasize, the immensely stronger hold upon us that our very early associations have than those of later times. Kant, as I say, invented a new moral argument for the existence of God, and that, in varying forms, was extremely popular during the 19th century. It has all sorts of forms. One form is to say that there would be no right or wrong unless God existed. I'm not for the moment concerned with whether there is a difference between right and wrong, or whether there is not. That is another question. The point I am concerned with is that if you are quite sure there is a difference between right and wrong, you are then in this situation. Is that difference due to God's fiat, or is it not? If it is due to God's fiat, then for God himself there is no difference between right and wrong, and it is no longer a significant statement to say.
Um, I don't really feel like that's a well, okay. Like I've said about a bunch of these other arguments, I think that to really do them justice, you have to go into a lot more depth than he's going to be able to do here. He's obviously just giving a quick overview. The way he presents this argument here, I think it wouldn't be particularly hard to refute that. Um, so essentially, you could I've heard this responded to in a few different ways. So one way I've heard it responded to is that God is the lawgiver and he does decide what is right and wrong, but also his nature is essentially good and therefore he always does the right thing and doesn't need to be subject to any law to do it. And another way I've heard it put is like God invents or decides what is right and wrong, and he's not obligated to follow those rules. But he makes the rules in accordance with his divine plan, and then acts in and then because his morality is designed to follow his divine plan, and then also his actions are designed to follow his divine plan, then those two things are going to align with each other without him having to be subject to the rules that he invented or whatever. I don't find that particularly well. Essentially, I don't believe that that's true. I'm not a religious person myself, but um, I don't know. It sounds like Russell is presenting this as though it were some kind of really persuasive refutation of the idea that a god created right and wrong, like the idea that if that's the case, he would then have to be subject to his own rules, and as if that's a belief we could not abide or refute. I don't know. Um, let's go on.
God is good. If you are going to say, as theologians do, that God is good, you must then say that right and wrong have some meaning which is independent of God's fiat, because God.
Yeah, I don't actually quite agree with that either. Like, if you have a theistic worldview, you don't necessarily need to say that right and wrong are independent of God's fiat. You could just say that they come from His nature or from His decisions, and then He behaves in accordance with that nature, or you know.
God's fiats are good and not bad, independently of the mere fact that he made them. If you are going to say that, you will then have to say that it is not only through God that right and wrong came into being, but that they are, in their essence, logically anterior to God. You could, of course, if you liked, say that there was a superior deity who gave orders to the God who made this world, or could take up the line that some of the Gnostics took up, a line which I often thought was a very plausible one, that, as a matter of fact, this world that we know was made by the devil at a moment when God was not looking. There's a good deal to be said for that, and I'm not concerned to refute it.
Um, so he almost got into presenting the Euthyphro dilemma there. So the Euthyphro dilemma was it was a question that was posed by the ancient Greeks. I think Euthyphro was a person involved in the conversation. I want to say maybe Socrates posed it to Euthyphro or something like that. So the idea was that there's a question about uh, do the gods command what is good? Do they command it because it's good, or is it good because they command it? And then there's whole like lines of argumentation about plausibility of each of those answers, and then there's some people that just reject the question, say that it's not a true dilemma. Um, he kind of Russell here kind of alluded to one of the forks of that dilemma in saying that that perhaps God gives his commands or decides what's right and wrong because he is referring to some other standard of right and wrong. So that would be one of the options offered by the Euthyphro dilemma. Um, he didn't really mention the other one, weirdly enough. The argument for the remedying of injustice, though. This is one that I don't I don't recognize it by name. I guess we'll see what this is.
The argument for the remedying of injustice. Then there is another very curious form of moral argument, which is this. They say that the existence of God is required in order to bring justice into the world. In the part of this universe that we know, there is great injustice, and often the good suffer, and often the wicked prosper, and one hardly knows which of those is the more annoying. But if you are going to have justice in the universe as a whole, you have to suppose a future life to redress the balance of life here on earth. So they say that there must be a God, and there must be heaven and hell, in order that in the long run there may be justice. That is a very curious argument. If you looked at the matter from a scientific point of view, you would say, after all, I know only this world. I do not know about the rest of the universe, but so far as one can argue at all on probabilities, one would say that probably this world is a fair sample, and if there is injustice here, the odds are that there is injustice elsewhere also. Supposing you got a crate of oranges that you opened and you found all the top layer of oranges bad, you would not argue the underneath ones must be good, so as to redress the balance. You would say, probably the whole lot is a bad consignment. And that is really what a scientific person would argue about the universe. He would say, here we find in this world a great deal of injustice, and so far as that goes, there is a reason for supposing that justice does not rule in the world, and therefore, so far as it goes, it affords a moral argument against deity and not in favour of one.
I definitely agree with Russell on this one. I think if people really are are arguing that that there must be a God so as to provide uh some kind of divine justice in contrast to the world that we see today, that strikes me as a really silly and weak argument. It just sounds like wishful thinking. And for the most part, I agree with Russell's refutation of it. Now, I suppose that there isn't. He doesn't go into the question of whether justice and injustice are even real things to begin with, but I don't think it's necessary to do that to dispense with an argument that's this silly in the first place.
Know that the sort of intellectual arguments that I have been talking to you about are not what really moves people. What really moves people to believe in God is not any intellectual argument at all. Most people believe in God because they have been taught from early infancy to do it. And
I definitely believe that that's true. So I believe that the function of apologetics is not to convert people to a religion. I believe that the function of apologetics is mostly to shore up the doubts of people who are already religious.
that's the main reason. Then I think that the next most powerful reason is the wish for safety. A sort of feeling that there is a big brother. That plays a very profound part in influencing people's desire for a belief in God. The character of Christ. I now want to say a few words upon a topic which I often think is not quite sufficiently dealt with by rationalists, and that is the question whether Christ was the best and wisest of men.
So now I suppose he didn't explicitly say this, but it sounds like he might be done talking about uh, the reasons why he doesn't believe that a God exists. Um, I wasn't really happy with the way he explained that, because he was really just responding to some of the popular arguments that he's heard for theism, and he wasn't really giving arguments against it almost at all. So I don't know. Uh, Mediocre, I say.
It is generally taken for granted that we should all agree that that was so. I do not, myself. I think that there are a good many points upon which I agree with Christ, a great deal more than the professing Christians do. I do not know that I could go with him all the way, but I could go with him much further than most professing Christians can. You will remember that he said, "Resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." That is not a new precept or a new principle. It was used by Lao Tse and Buddha some 500 or 600 years before Christ. But it is not a principle which, as a matter of fact, Christians accept. I have no doubt that the present Prime Minister, for instance, is a most sincere Christian, but I should not advise any of you to go and smite him on one cheek. I think you might find that he thought this text was intended in a figurative sense. Then there is another point which I consider excellent. You will remember that Christ said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." That principle I do not think you would find was popular in the law courts of Christian countries. I have known in my time quite a number of judges who were very earnest Christians, and none of them felt that they were acting contrary to Christian principles in what they did. Then Christ says, "Give to him that asketh of thee, and from him that would borrow of thee turn not thou away." That is a very good principle. Your chairman has reminded you that we are not here to talk politics, but I cannot help observing that the last general election was fought on the question of how desirable it was to turn away from him that would borrow of thee, so that one must assume that the Liberals and Conservatives of this country are composed of people who do not agree with the teaching of Christ, because they certainly did very emphatically turn away on that occasion.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with British politics of 1927, or at least not not very much. I suppose this would be the post World War One era. I really don't know the election that he's talking about, or how much it has to do with borrowing, lending. I don't know, giving to the poor, something like that. But the bigger point that he's making, I think, um, holds up pretty well. I think it is true that religious people are more likely to use their religious morality to justify their actions or to condemn other people rather than using that religious morality as a guide for making decisions in real time.
Then there is one other maxim of Christ, which I think has a great deal in it, but I do not find that it is very popular among some of our Christian friends. He says, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that which thou hast, and give to the poor." That is a very excellent maxim, but, as I say, it is not much practiced. All these, I think, are good maxims, although they are a little difficult to live up to. I do not profess to live up to them myself, but then, after all, it is not quite the same thing as for...
Yeah, that's true. So I think anybody who really wanted to live up to all the moral commandments of Christianity can't really do it. I don't actually think it's possible. And I don't know. That last maxim that he was describing, that people should just sell what they own and give it all to the poor. Uh, I've got some mixed feelings on that one too. I do think charity is good. I don't want to say that people shouldn't give some of what they have to less fortunate people, and I think particularly people who are well off should do that. But do I think you should sell off everything you own and give it all away? No, I don't think so. Um I think that that's asking too much of people, and for the sake of an outcome that I'm not even sure is a good outcome. I mean, if everyone did that, obviously it just wouldn't work. Everyone giving everything they own to everyone else. Uh, I don't know. I would rather have um, I would rather see a more modest proposal about that people should give what they can afford to give to help people in need. Not necessarily that they should feel obligated to give away everything they own and that they're guilty of some kind of transgression just by by the mere fact of owning property and not giving it away. Um, yeah.
For a Christian. Defects in Christ's teaching. Having granted the excellence of these maxims, I come to certain points in which I do not believe that one can grant either the superlative wisdom or the superlative goodness of Christ, as depicted in the Gospels. And here I may say that one is not concerned with the historical question. Historically, it is quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all, and if he did, we do not know anything about him, so that I am not concerned with the historical question, which is a very difficult one. I am concerned with Christ.
I think I'm not on his side on that one. I'm not uh, really an expert in biblical history, but I tend to think that there probably was a historical Jesus.
As he appears in the Gospels, taking the Gospel narrative as it stands, and there one does find some things that do not seem to be very wise. For one thing, he certainly thought that his second coming would occur in clouds of glory before the death of all the people who were living at that time. There are a great many texts that prove that. He says, for instance, "Ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." Then he says, "There are some standing here which shall not taste death till the Son of Man comes into his kingdom." And there are a lot of places where it is quite clear that he believed that his second coming would happen during the lifetime of many then living. That was the belief of his earlier followers, and it was the basis of a good deal of his moral teaching. When he said, "Take no thought for the morrow," and things of that sort, it was very largely because he thought that the second coming was going to be very soon, and that all ordinary, mundane affairs did not count. I have, as a matter of fact, known some Christians who did believe that the second coming was imminent. I knew a parson who frightened his congregation terribly by telling them that the second coming was very imminent indeed.
As they often still do today.
But they were much consoled when they found that he was planting trees in his garden. The early Christians did really believe it, and they did abstain from such things as planting trees in their gardens, because they did accept from Christ the belief that the second coming was imminent. In that respect, clearly, he was not so wise as some other people have been, and he was certainly not superlatively wise. The moral problem. Then you come to moral questions. There is one very serious defect, to my mind, in Christ's moral character, and that is that he believed in hell. I do not myself feel that any person who is really profoundly humane can believe in everlasting punishment.
This is one that I guess I haven't heard yet completely the direction that he's going with it, but the gist of what he's saying aligns very closely with with an argument that I do believe in. I think the moral problem with this, it's not so much just believing that there is a hell, but believing that the existence of hell is a good and just thing, right? Which I think um, you're going to get different answers from different religious believers on whether or not they do believe that the existence of hell is good. A lot of times they'll squirm and refuse to answer the question, like is it good for anybody to go to hell and be tortured and so on. I think some of the more fundamentalist types are the type of people who are more likely to say yes, that it actually is good for people to go to hell and be tortured after they die. And that I find to be um, much more intellectually defensible, but also much less morally defensible, just in terms of it not aligning with our values in any other sphere of life. Certainly not with my values. And I think even with those same people's values as applied to other situations. Um, then there are also going to be Christians who will say going to hell isn't good, but it's that's not God's doing. You send yourself to hell by you choose it with your own bad behavior or something, and they'll give those kind of answers, which I think are much less intellectually defensible, but in some ways more morally defensible, just because um, just the fact that they even are trying to squirm out of the question in the first place belies some kind of recognition of the problem at hand. Um, I think they really can't go on believing that torturing people in hell is a good thing to do, while holding a value system that's compatible with the society we actually live in.
Christ, certainly as depicted in the Gospels, did believe in everlasting punishment, and one does find repeatedly a vindictive fury against those people who would not listen to his preaching, an attitude which is not uncommon with preachers, but which does somewhat detract from superlative excellence. You do not, for instance, find that attitude in Socrates. You find him quite bland and urbane toward the people who would not listen to him. And it is, to my mind, far more worthy of a sage to take that line than to take the line of indignation. You probably all remember the sort of things that Socrates was saying when he was dying, and the sort of things that he generally did say to people who did not agree with him.
Interestingly enough, Russell was arguing against, or at least asserting that he did not believe in the existence of a historical Jesus. I wonder what he'd have to say about the existence of a historical Socrates. Um, since the evidence for that, I would say, is on similar ground to the evidence for a historical Jesus.
You will find that in the Gospels Christ said, "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell?" That was said to people who did not like his preaching. It is not really, to my mind, quite the best tone, and there are a great many of these things about hell. There is, of
Here he is, tone policing Jesus.
course, the familiar text about the sin against the Holy Ghost. "Whosoever speaketh against the Holy Ghost, it shall not be forgiven him, neither in this world nor in the world to come." That text has caused an unspeakable amount of misery in the world, for all sorts of people have imagined that they have committed the sin against the Holy Ghost, and thought that it would not be forgiven them either in this world or in the world to come. I really do not think that a person with a proper degree of kindliness in his nature would have put fears and terrors of that sort into the world. Then Christ says, "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." And he goes on about the wailing and gnashing of teeth. It comes in one verse after another. And
Uh, I really do feel like the belief in hell is one of the worst things about religion. Of course, not all religious people believe in hell. Not even all Christians believe in hell. Um, but yeah, I mean, if it's just gonna. I mean, the idea is I think it's supposed to scare people into good behavior or into avoiding bad behavior. And I'm sure it sometimes succeeds at doing that, but I think in general, putting people into a fearful and a fearful and distressed state of mind is not likely to produce better behavior. I think um, even if it succeeds at uh, at forbidding certain bad behaviors that it was aimed at, I think it's very likely to produce other bad behaviors. I think people just behave a lot more with a lot more hostility toward one another when they're in that kind of frame of mind, and when you're threatening them with eternal torture and damnation and fire and brimstone and all of that. I think the psychological effect of that is just pretty awful.
Quite manifest to the reader that there is a certain pleasure in contemplating wailing and gnashing of teeth, or else it would not occur so often. Then you all, of course,
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I think people do take pleasure in the thought of others suffering. You guys might know the word Schadenfreude. So this is when you um, take pleasure in observing other people's misfortune. And so this isn't quite the same thing he's describing. He's describing taking pleasure in imagining other people's misfortune. But I think that this really is a big part of the appeal of the belief in hell. People want to believe that you can't just be really bad and get away with it. I think people would rather believe that those who commit wrongdoings are going to get what's coming to them. Uh, I don't think we have good reason to believe that that's actually true, but I get why it's appealing, right? It is a sad fact of the world that people can mistreat one another and get away with it sometimes. And if you believe in hell, then you believe that there's a remedy to that. So I can understand why that's appealing.
remember about the sheep and the goats. How, at the second coming, he is going to divide the sheep from the goats, and he is going to say to the goats, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire." He continues, "And these shall go away into everlasting fire." Then he says again, "If thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed, than having 2 hands to go into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where the worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched." He repeats that again and again also. I must say that I think all this doctrine that hell fire is a punishment for sin is a doctrine of cruelty. It is a doctrine that put cruelty into the world and gave the world generations of cruel torture.
I think that's mostly true. Now, I should point out that this is not the origin of cruelty in the world. This belief comes from a time when the world was full of cruelty, probably even more than it is today. So I don't want to overstate the case for that, but I do think the belief in hell has perpetuated a lot of that cruelty.
The Christ of the Gospels, if you could take him as his chroniclers represent him, would certainly have to be considered partly responsible for that. There are other things of less importance. There is the instance of the Gadarene swine, where it certainly was not very kind to the pigs to put the devils into them and make them rush down the hill to the sea. You must remember that he was omnipotent, and he could have made the devils simply go away, but he chose to send them into the pigs. Then there is the curious story of the fig tree, which always rather puzzled me. You remember what happened about the fig tree? He was hungry, and seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And Peter saith unto him, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursedst is withered away. This is a very curious story, because it was not the right time of year for figs, and you really could not blame the tree. I cannot myself feel that either in the matter of wisdom or in the matter of virtue Christ stands quite as high as some other people known to history. I think I should put Buddha and Socrates above him in those respects.
Buddha and Socrates have their own moral problems. They're both very sexist for one thing, but so I'm not so sure that either of those people would align with our present day values all that well. But Russell does have a point here, which is that if you are going to believe that that Jesus was some kind of perfect moral paragon, that this obligates you to believe in the goodness of all kinds of weird and vindictive behaviors that he evidently did if you believe the stories in the Bible.
Factor. As I said before, I do not think that the real reason why people accept religion has anything to do with argumentation. They accept religion on emotional grounds. One is often told that it is a very wrong thing to attack religion, because religion makes men virtuous. So I am told. I have not noticed it. You know, of course, the parody of that argument in Samuel Butler's book, Erewhon Revisited. You will remember that in Erewhon there is a certain Higgs who arrives in a remote country, and after spending some time there, he escapes from that country in a balloon. 20 years later, he comes back to that country and finds a new religion in which he is worshipped under the name of the Sun Child, and it is said that he ascended into heaven. He finds that the Feast of the Ascension is about to be celebrated, and he hears Professors Hankey and Pankey say to each other that they never set eyes on the man Higgs, and they hope they never will. But they are the high priests of the religion of the Sun Child. He is very indignant. He comes up to them and he says, "I'm going to expose all this humbug and tell the people of Erewhon that it was only I, the man Higgs, and I went up in a balloon." He was told, "You must not do that, because all the morals of this country are bound round this myth, and if they once know that you did not ascend into heaven, they will all become wicked." And so he...
Yeah, this is an interesting thing about uh, religion and Christianity in particular is that I think religion kind of absorbed and appropriated a lot of the morals of society and becomes bound up with them, and then takes credit for their existence. Um, so uh, you know, a lot of these moral arguments for religion fail on those grounds. But there is a grain of truth to it in that people's morals are tied in their own minds to their religion, and therefore disruption to their religious beliefs really is pretty likely to spill over into disruption in their moral beliefs as well. Uh, yeah, just because of how intimately tied together they are.
He is persuaded of that, and he goes quietly away. That is the idea, that we should all be wicked if we did not hold to the Christian religion. It seems to me that the people who have held to it have been for the most part extremely wicked. You find this curious fact, that the more
That's a little bit of a strange thing to say. Like I think if you were to say that Christians have been for the most part extremely wicked, um, I could I could accept that coming from a person who believes that humanity in general is extremely wicked. I'm not sure I would believe that Christians are any worse than the rest of humanity.
religion of any period, and the more profound has been the dogmatic belief, the greater has been the cruelty, and the worse has been the state of affairs. In the so-called ages of faith, when men really did believe the Christian religion in all its completeness, there was the Inquisition with its tortures. There were millions of unfortunate women burned as witches, and there was every kind of cruelty practiced upon all sorts of people in the name of religion.
Yeah, so that is true, and of course we had religious wars on top of that. Um, it's really hard to say though, how those same societies would have behaved had they been less religious. Um, I'm tempted to make a comparison to something like China, as the less religious society than Europe. Now, China does have a lot of belief systems that that are debatably religious, right? So there's Buddhism, there's Taoism, there's Confucianism, and so on. People will alternately describe these as philosophies and sometimes as religions. Confucianism, particularly, I think you would rarely hear that described as a religion, but maybe sometimes you would. Um, And I think in China, to the best of my historical knowledge, they have had less conflict between those belief systems, compared to the kind of crazy amount of conflict between Christianity and Islam, compared to the crazy amount of conflict between Protestants and Catholics, compared to the crazy amount of conflict between um, Christian societies and probably also Muslim societies persecuting minority religious beliefs or people they considered heretical within their own societies. I don't think, as to the best of my knowledge, I don't think China has had as much of that, perhaps up until the 1800s, because they did have a giant civil war, a religious civil war then. Um, but has China then been more peaceful overall because of the absence of those kind of conflicts? Um, I don't know. I don't know the answer. Just the fact that the answer is not clear to me is enough to make me not particularly persuaded, that that religion is responsible for generating a whole bunch of conflict and cruelty. I mean, perhaps it is. Uh, I mean, of course, there is a lot of conflict and cruelty that is specifically tied to religion, but it's just a matter of like, does human aggression get channeled through religion, or does religion generate more human aggression? And I just don't know the answer to that question.
You find, as you look around the world,
Although I should say, like, it's very likely that it's a lot of human aggression. I mean, I suppose here's my intuitive answer is that it's a lot of human aggression getting channeled through religion, and perhaps a little bit of religion generating human aggression, perhaps.
that every single bit of progress in humane feeling, every improvement in the criminal law, every step toward the diminution of war, every step toward better treatment of the colored races, or every mitigation of slavery, every moral progress that there has been in the world, has been consistently opposed by the organized churches of the world.
Yeah, so that's true. There have been quite a lot of religious arguments against things that we would consider moral progress. There's also been a lot of religious arguments for them. Um, yeah, that's a whole really complicated issue. I'd like to talk more about it some other time, but yeah, let's just move on for now.
Deliberately that the Christian religion, as organized in its churches, has been and still is the principal enemy of moral progress in the world.
Principal enemy of moral progress in the world. Wow, that's a pretty big claim, particularly as he was just not so long ago referring to fascists and so on. Well, anyway,
How the churches have retarded progress. You may think that I am going too far when I say that that is still so. I do not think that I am. Take one fact. You will bear with me if I mention it. It is not a pleasant fact, but the churches compel one to mention facts that are not pleasant. Supposing that in this world that we live in today, an inexperienced girl is married to a syphilitic man. In that case, the Catholic Church says, this is an indissoluble sacrament. You must stay together for life. And no steps of any sort must be taken by that woman to prevent herself from giving birth to syphilitic children. That is
yeah, so this is true. Religions do a lot of times have really stupid moral rules that people feel bound to. Yeah, this is a pretty fair point. I don't know that that specifically has much to do with them retarding progress, but nevertheless, I think it's a pretty fair criticism of, in this case, Catholicism.
what the Catholic Church says. I say that that is fiendish cruelty, and nobody whose natural sympathies have not been warped by dogma, or whose moral nature was not absolutely dead to all sense of suffering, could maintain that it is right and proper that that state of things should continue. That is only an example. There are a great many ways in which at the present moment the Church, by its insistence upon what it chooses to call morality, inflicts upon all sorts of people undeserved and unnecessary suffering. And of course, as we know, it is in its major part an opponent still of progress and of improvement in all the ways that diminish suffering in the world, because it has chosen to label as morality a certain narrow set of rules of conduct which have nothing to do with human happiness. And when you
Nothing to do with human happiness. That feels like an overreach to me. I think like even for the rule against divorce, um, I'm not necessarily against divorce. I don't think divorce should be prohibited, but I think there's if the Catholic Church is going to have a rule against divorce, I think it's not terribly difficult to imagine that might align with a certain conception of human happiness. Um, I, I think to argue against it, you essentially um, have to just point out some of the bad outcomes that come from it. That it doesn't achieve the aim of human happiness, right? But but I don't think it's actually true that it has nothing to do whatsoever with human happiness. I think churches that do have those kinds of rules probably really do believe that humans are going to flourish a little better under those rules than they would otherwise.
say that this or that ought to be done because it would make for human happiness, they think that has nothing to do with the matter at all. What has human happiness to do with morals? The object of morals is not to make people happy. Fear, the foundation of religion.
It okay, so he says the object of morals is not to make people happy according to moralizing religious people. Um, but he doesn't really give his own argument for why we should consider happiness to be the object of morals. I don't know. I think that's an interesting question in its own right. I get that he's just giving a quick overview of it here, but I think that's not something that we should just take for granted. The degree to which we should consider happiness to be a worthwhile goal.
Religion is based, I think, primarily and mainly upon fear. It is partly the terror of the unknown, and partly, as I have said, the wish to feel that you have a kind of elder brother who will stand by you in all your troubles and disputes. Fear is the basis of the whole thing. Fear of the mysterious, fear of defeat, fear of death. Fear is the parent of cruelty, and therefore it is no wonder if cruelty and religion have gone hand in hand.
Uh, an interesting one that he hasn't mentioned yet. I suppose. Well, I'm interested to see if he's going to. Um, I think a big part of the appeal of religion is actually fear of the unknown or fear of one's own ignorance. It's just the fact that religion provides a lot of easy answers that people can accept to make them feel like they understand their lives uh, better than they really do. It's that they get to feel like they have a grasp on what's going on around them. And so in a way, it's pretty successful at not at generating that fear, but at mitigating that fear, right? And likewise, to some degree with the fear of death. Um, so it's in some ways it's aimed at alleviating some of these fears, but in other ways it might generate fears, right? Like by believing in hell. Um, so I don't know. There's a lot to say about the relationship between fear and religion. Say that it's the foundation of religion. I don't know. I'm not sure what the I think my impulse is to disagree with that, but I don't know. That feels like a another topic that deserves more depth than we're going to be able to get into today.
It is because fear is at the basis of those two things. In this world, we can now begin a little to understand things and a little to master them by help of science, which has forced its way step by step against the Christian religion, against the churches, and against the opposition of all the old precepts. Science can help us to get over this craven fear in which mankind has lived for so many generations. Science can teach us, and I think our own hearts can teach us, no longer to look around for imaginary supports, no longer to invent allies in the sky, but rather to look to our own efforts here below to make this world a fit place to live in.
That sounds a little bit dubious. To be drawing to say that science can give you all those kinds of lessons. I mean, I understand that living in a world informed by science that has received a lot of the benefits we have from science, uh, you can then those kind of beliefs seem more plausible in light of us living in a world that has benefited from science the way that we have. Um, so yeah, I guess we should probably be charitable and assume that that's probably what he means, as opposed to what I initially took him to mean, which is that those are scientifically grounded beliefs, because I think they're not.
Instead of the sort of place that the churches in all these centuries have made it. What we must do. We want to stand upon our own feet and look fair and square at the world. Its good facts, its bad facts, its beauties and its ugliness. See the world as it is and be not afraid of it. Conquer the world by intelligence, and not merely by being slavishly subdued by the terror that comes from it. The whole conception of God is a conception derived from the ancient Oriental despotisms. It is a conception quite unworthy of free men. When you hear people in church debasing themselves and saying that they are miserable sinners and all the rest of it, it seems contemptible and not worthy of self-respecting human beings. We ought to stand up and look the world frankly in the face. We ought to make the best we can of the world, and if it is not so good as we wish, after all, it will still be better than what these others have made of it in all these ages. A good world needs knowledge, kindliness, and courage. It does not need a regretful hankering after the past, or a fettering of the free intelligence by the words uttered long ago by ignorant men. It needs a fearless outlook and a free intelligence. It needs hope for the future, not looking back all the time toward a past that is dead, which we trust will be far surpassed by the future that our intelligence can create.
Well, I do think he finished pretty strong there. I do think his vision of of what we should want for the future is a lot more compelling than some other parts of what he said. All right, let's move on to another video here. All right, so I suppose this is going to be. Let's look at the description here. This is going to be a famous radio debate from 1948 about whether there is or is not a God. And I don't know who this other person is. Copleston. Frederick Copleston.
In 1948, the BBC broadcast a debate between Bertrand Russell and F.C. Copleston concerning the existence of God. Lord Russell, who died in 1970, will be remembered for many reasons, not least for his important contribution to the development of logic. Father Copleston is a Jesuit priest, now principal of Heathrop College and professor of the history of philosophy in the University of London. Russell's position in the debate is that of an agnostic. Copleston's position is that of a believer who holds that the existence of God can be proved. We shall listen in a moment to an edited portion of this debate.
That's a strong claim that the existence of God can be proved. I I've participated in and witnessed quite a lot of debates about the existence of God, and I've rarely seen theists actually claim that it can be proved. I have come across quite a lot who say that they feel it's been proved to them personally by their own experience and personal relationship with God and that kind of thing. But they don't typically go so far as to say that they can prove it without any doubt to someone else. Now they do have all these arguments for God, including some of the ones we went over in the previous video. Like they'll say, there's a first cause argument, or they'll go with design or fine tuning or moral arguments of those kind of things. And I think a lot of religious people do find those to be compelling arguments for the existence of God, but rarely will they actually claim that they can uh, prove it without any doubt. Um, although I suppose maybe I shouldn't interpret the word proof to mean that this guy is gonna claim that we should have no doubt whatsoever after hearing his argument, as opposed to just being convinced. I suppose people do use proof in different ways, but we'll see.
That part in which Russell and Copleston discuss what is sometimes called the argument from contingency. This is a form of cosmological argument. Like any form of cosmological argument, the argument from contingency begins with an empirical premise, one whose truth is known through experience. This premise is, of course, that there are contingent things.
There are contingent. That does not sound like an empirical premise to me.
A contingent thing, according to Copleston, is one which does not contain within itself the reason for its existence.
Yeah, this is not actually an empirical claim. So it sounds like he's going to suppose, first of all, that there is a reason for its existence, and secondly, that the reason for the thing's existence must exist outside of itself. And he can go ahead and believe those things, but it's strange to call them empirical.
If we are to explain why a particular contingent thing exists, we must mention, in so doing, some other thing or things on which its existence depends. Those who accept the argument from contingency hold that we must, in the long run, have recourse to some non-contingent or necessary thing if we are to explain the existence of contingent things. Either the principle of sufficient reason is false, and there is in the end no sufficient explanation why contingent things exist, or else there is something having a property peculiar to God, namely, of containing within itself the reason for its existence.
I don't see why it would why it would be the case. Supposing you believe that contingent things exist and non-contingent things exist, why would there need to be only one non-contingent thing? That doesn't seem to follow logically. Like you could believe in lots of non-contingent things even if you believe in contingent. I don't know.
If we find it unacceptable that the existence of contingent things should in the end have no explanation, we must, it is argued, conclude that there is a God. We join the discussion at the point where Copleston states the argument from contingency in the form in which he himself favours it.
Well, for clarity's sake, I divide the argument into distinct stages. First of all, I should say, we know that there are at least some beings in the world which do not contain in themselves the reason for their existence. For example, I depend on my parents, and now on the air, on food, and so on. Now, secondly, the world is simply the real or imagined totality or aggregate of individual objects, none of which contain in themselves alone the reason of their existence. There isn't any world distinct from the objects which form it, any more than the human race is something apart from the members.
Of course, it's it's not empirically a fact what counts as an individual object, though, right? I mean, objects have parts, and those parts are that might be considered objects too, and objects can form larger systems, and those systems can be considered objects as well. So I think that's one fairly obvious objection to his claim here. Another one would be, like I was saying earlier, that he's saying that the world consists entirely of these contingent things, and I just don't understand where he's getting that from. Um, I mean, it seems like something that most people would intuitively believe, but he seems to just be taking it for granted. Well, we'll see if he tries to justify it, but I don't expect that he's going to.
Therefore, I should say, since objects or events exist, and since no object of experience contains within itself the reason of its existence, this reason, the totality of objects, must have a reason external to itself, and that reason must be an existent being. Well, this being...
Being... It's funny that he's using the word being here, right? Like, so I don't know why the reason, as he puts it, couldn't just be another object or another event. Why does it have to be a being? But, well, I mean, actually, I do know why. It's because he's purposely trying to argue for the existence of a being, but I don't think it's logically necessary that it should have to be.
Is either itself the reason for its own existence, or it is not. If it is, well and good. If not, then we must proceed further. But if we proceed to infinity in that sense, then there's no explanation of existence at all. So, I should say, in order to explain existence...
It sounds like he seems to think that he has to have the explanation for existence. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is no explanation for existence. It could just mean that we don't have one. And like I was saying earlier, I think a lot of the appeal of religion has to do with fear of one's own ignorance, right? This guy seems unwilling to accept the idea that we could just have no explanation for how and why things exist. He seems to feel compelled to produce one.
We must come to a being which contains within itself the reason for its own existence, that is to say, which cannot not exist. This...
It's funny that, you know, some of the ways that religious people will describe God, sometimes they'll say he cannot not exist. Now, of course, if we were to really take this guy at his word, then he's begging the question, right? If we were to just accept that God cannot not exist, then there would be no argument.
Raises a great many points, and it's not altogether easy to know where to begin. But I think that perhaps in answering your argument, the best point with which to begin is the question of a necessary being. The word necessary, I should maintain, can only be applied significantly to propositions, and in fact only to such as are analytic, that is to say, such as it is self-contradictory to deny. I could only admit a necessary being if there were a being whose existence it is self-contradictory to deny. I should like to know whether you would accept Leibniz's division of propositions into truths of reason and truths of fact, the former, the truths of reason, being necessary.
I certainly should not subscribe...
So he's saying that he can't accept the existence of a necessary being, but he can accept the existence of necessary analytical propositions, which it would be self-contradictory to deny. I think I probably agree with him on that.
To what seems to be Leibniz's idea of truths and reason and truths of fact, since it would appear that for him there are in the long run only analytic propositions. I don't want to uphold the whole philosophy of Leibniz. I've made use of his argument from contingent to necessary being, basing the argument on the principle of sufficient reason, simply because it seems to me a brief and clear formulation of what is, in my opinion, the fundamental metaphysical argument for God's existence.
But to my mind, a necessary proposition has got to be analytic. I don't see what else it can mean. And analytic propositions are always complex and logically somewhat late. Rational animals are animals is an analytic proposition. But a proposition such as this is an animal can never be analytic.
Well,
in fact, all the propositions that can be analytic are somewhat late in the build-up of propositions.
Take the proposition, if there is a contingent being, then there is a necessary being. I consider that that proposition, hypothetically expressed, is a necessary proposition. If you are going to call every necessary proposition an analytic proposition, then in order to avoid a dispute in terminology, I will agree to call it analytic, though I don't consider it a tautological proposition. But the proposition is a necessary proposition only on the supposition that there is a contingent being. That there is a contingent being actually existing has to be discovered by experience. And the proposition that there is a contingent being is certainly not an analytic proposition.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I buy that that's something that you could discover by experience, but I also don't want to call it an analytic proposition. They're using analytic proposition to mean a belief that's purely logical and not subject to evidence. I believe is what they mean. They're as opposed to just a fact of the matter. But to say that contingent beings exist, yeah, that's I wouldn't even know how to classify that, right? Because if it's no, you know what? I think I would have to call it non-analytical, because if it's true, then it would have to be a fact of the matter. I just don't know how you could discover something like that through experience, right? So I'm trying to be charitable to this guy here. So he was saying that his own existence is due to his parents and water and air and food and things like that. I mean, from a common sense perspective, sure, I can grant that, but from a logical perspective, I don't think I can. To say that those things are reasons for his existence, it's just a very nebulous way of describing that relationship, and I feel like I don't want to say that he's equivocating on purpose, but I think the effect of his argument is that it's equivocal.
Though once you know, I should maintain, that there is a contingent being, it follows of necessity that there is a necessary being.
Once you know that there is a contingent being, it follows from necessity, or that there is a necessary being. Yeah, I think he hasn't yet made a compelling case for why that should have to be true.
The difficulty of this argument is that I don't admit the idea of a necessary being, and I don't admit that there is any particular meaning in calling other beings contingent. These phrases don't, for me, have a significance, except within a logic that I reject.
A contingent being is a being which has not in itself the complete reason for its existence. That's what I mean by...
Well, he's just repeating the definition that he gave earlier, but you know, Russell here has already said that this is part of a logic that he rejects. So I don't know what good it does to repeat that.
Contingent being. You know as well as I do that the existence of neither of us can be explained without reference to something or somebody outside us, our parents, for example.
That it can't be explained without those things. No, I don't think that that's logically the case. Now, I do think, of course, that that every human has parents, that every human depends on the ecosystem in which they live, in a very common sense fact of the matter, um, that is true. Um, I don't think I could just grant him that it logically has to be true, which seems to be what he's implying here, that it must be the case that that every human is a contingent being. Yeah, I think this is pretty weak.
The necessary being, on the other hand, means a being that must and cannot not exist. You may say that there is no such being, but you will find it hard to convince me that you do not understand the terms I am using. If you do not understand them, then how can you be entitled to say that such a being does not exist, if that is what you do say?
Well, I will say that what you have been saying brings us back, it seems to me, to the ontological argument that there is a being whose essence involves existence, so that his existence is analytic. That seems to me to be impossible. And it raises, of course, the question what one means by existence. And as to this, I think a subject named can never be significantly said to exist, but only a subject described, and that existence, in fact, quite definitely, is not a predicate.
That's interesting that he compares this to an ontological argument. Trying to think, like, do I buy that comparison? Yeah, I think I do, because Copleston has said that that we're talking about a being that cannot not exist. I do think he's implying kind of an ontological property of God here. So I think this isn't quite the same as a couple of the other ontological arguments that I've heard, but I think it's the parallel makes sense.
Well, you say, I believe, that it is bad grammar, or rather bad syntax, to say, for example, T.S. Eliot exists. One ought to say, for example, the author of Murder in the Cathedral exists. Are you going to say that the proposition, the cause of the world exists, is without meaning? You may say that the world has no cause, but I fail to see how you can say that the proposition that the cause of the world exists is meaningless. Put it in the form of a question. Has the world a cause, or does a cause of the world exist? Most people surely would understand the question, even if they don't agree about the answer.
Most people would think they understand the question because it's grammatically simple. The sentence is easy to parse. It's easy to create the illusion that one understands a question like that, but I don't actually think it's true that most people would understand that question.
Certainly, the question, does the cause of the world exist, is a question that has meaning. But if you say, yes, God is the cause of the world, where using God as a proper name, then God exists will not be a statement that has meaning. That is the position that I'm maintaining. And therefore, it will follow that it cannot be an analytic proposition ever to say that this or that exists. Take, for example, suppose you take as your subject the existent round square. It would look like an analytic proposition that the existent round square exists, but it doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't. Then surely you can't say it doesn't exist unless you have a conception of what existence is. As to the phrase, existent round square, I should say that it has no meaning at all.
I quite agree. Then I should say the same thing in another context in reference to a necessary being.
Yeah. So at first I didn't quite understand what Russell was saying, but I think it's just the way he explained himself didn't quite get through to me. But I think the argument he's saying does make sense here.
Seem to have arrived at an impasse. To say that a necessary being is a being that must exist and cannot not exist has for me a definite meaning. For you it has no meaning.
Well, we can press the point a little, I think. A being that must exist and cannot not
Don't
exist
let him weasel out of that.
would surely, according to you, be a being whose essence involves existence.
Yes, a being the essence of which is to exist. But I should not be willing to argue the existence of God simply from the idea of his essence, because I don't think we have any clear intuition of God's essence as yet.
Oh, this is really strange here. So he's backing off the ontological argument pretty hard. He's saying he doesn't want to argue for God's existence from his essence because we don't know anything about the essence. But he says this like a few seconds after agreeing that God's essence is to exist. But well, I don't know. I mean, he says we don't have an intuition for what God's essence is. Maybe he's going to claim that he knows that by some other way than by intuition.
Have to argue from the world of experience to God.
Yes, I quite see the distinction. But at the same time, for a being with sufficient knowledge, it
So
would
yeah, by the way, he did. He said by experience rather than by intuition.
be true to say, here is this being whose essence involves existence.
Yes, certainly, if anybody saw God, he would see that God must exist.
So that, I mean, there is a being whose essence involves existence, although we don't know that essence. We only know there is such a being.
Yes, I should add, we don't know the essence a priori. It is only true a posteriori, through our experience of the world, that we come to a knowledge of the existence of that being. And then, one argues, the essence and existence must be identical, because if God's essence and God's existence were not identical, then some sufficient reason for this existence would have to be found beyond God.
Essence and his existence were not identical, then some. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
So it all turns on this question of sufficient reason. And I must say, you haven't defined sufficient reason in a way that I can understand. What do you mean by sufficient reason? You don't mean cause?
Not necessarily. Cause is a kind of sufficient reason. Only contingent being can have a cause. God is his own sufficient reason, but he is not cause of himself. By sufficient reason in the full sense, I mean an explanation adequate for the existence of some particular being.
Oh God, they're getting so caught up in semantics.
But when is an explanation adequate? Suppose I am about to make a flame with a match. You may say that the adequate explanation of that is that I rub it on the box.
Well, for practical purposes, but theoretically that's only a partial explanation. An adequate explanation must ultimately be a total explanation, to which nothing further can be added.
Then I can only say you're looking for something which can't be got and which one ought not to expect to get.
To say that one has not found it is one thing. To say that one should not look for it seems to me rather dogmatic. What I'm doing is to look for the reason, in this case the cause, of the objects, the real or imagined totality of which constitute what we call the universe.
It was pretty weird of him to say that it's an explanation to which nothing can be added. That sounds like a very hard proposition to support.
You say, I think, that the universe, or my existence if you prefer, or any other existence, is unintelligible.
I shouldn't say unintelligible. I think it is without explanation. Intelligible, to my mind, is a different thing. Intelligible has to do with the thing itself, intrinsically, and not with its relations.
Well, my point is that what we call the world is intrinsically unintelligible apart from the existence of God. You see, I don't believe that the infinity of the series of events, I mean a horizontal series, so to speak, if such an infinity could be proved, would be in the slightest degree relevant to the situation.
This is devolving into nonsense pretty quickly, I think.
If you add up chocolates, you get chocolates after all, and not a sheep. If you add up chocolates to infinity, you presumably get an infinite number of chocolates. So if you add up contingent being to infinity, you still get contingent beings, not a necessary being.
I don't. My inner math nerd is screeching about how he shouldn't say an infinite number of anything because infinity is not a number.
An infinite series of contingent beings would be, to my way of thinking, as unable to cause itself as one contingent being. However, you say, I think, that it is illegitimate to raise the question of what will explain the existence of any particular object.
It's quite all right if you mean by explaining it simply finding a cause for it.
Well, why stop at one particular object? Why shouldn't one raise the question of the cause of the existence of all particular objects?
Because I see no reason to think there is any. The whole concept of cause is one we derive from our observation of particular things. I see no reason whatsoever to suppose that the total has any cause whatsoever. I can illustrate what seems to me to be your fallacy. Every man who exists has a mother, and it seems to be your argument is, therefore the human race must have a mother. But obviously the human race hasn't a mother.
Hmm. The human race has mitochondrial Eve, but yeah, that's not literally a mother to the human race.
That's a different logical sphere.
Well, I can't really see a parity. If I was saying every object has a phenomenal cause, therefore the whole series has a phenomenal cause, there would be a parity. But I'm not saying that. I'm saying every object has a phenomenal cause, if you insist on the infinity of the series, but the series of phenomenal causes is an insufficient explanation of the series. Therefore, the series has not a phenomenal cause, but a transcendent cause.
Well, let's...
God, this is... I kind of follow what he's saying, but this is verging on word salad.
always assuming that not only every particular thing in the world, but the world as a whole, must have a cause. For that assumption I see no ground whatever. If you'll give me a ground, I'll listen to it.
Well, the series of events is either caused or it's not caused. If it is caused, there must obviously be a cause outside the series. If it's not caused, then it's sufficient to itself. And if it's sufficient to itself, it is what I call necessary. But it can't be necessary, since each member is contingent. And we've agreed that the total is no reality apart from the members. Therefore, it can't be necessary. And I should like to observe
a fallacy of composition, saying that because something is comprised of parts, therefore it must have the same properties as its parts have.
in passing that the statement that the world is simply there and is inexplicable can't be got out of logical analysis. I cannot see how science could be conducted on any other assumption than that of order and intelligibility in nature. The physicist presupposes, at least tacitly, that there is some sense in investigating nature and looking for the causes of events, just as the detective presupposes that there is some sense in looking for the cause of a murder.
Yeah, this is not actually true. I do not I do not accept that scientists have to accept causality to do science.
The metaphysician assumes that there is sense in looking for the reason or cause of phenomena, and not being a Kantian, I consider that the metaphysician is as justified in his assumption as the physicist.
I think scientists are looking for explanations for things, but that's different from looking for causes.
When Sartre, for example, says the world is gratuitous, I think that he hasn't sufficiently considered what is implied by gratuitous.
I think there seems to be a certain unwarrantable extension here. The physicist looks for causes. That does not necessarily imply that there are causes everywhere. A man may look for gold without assuming that there is gold everywhere. If he finds gold, well and good. If he doesn't, he's had bad luck. The same is true with the physicists look for causes. As for Sartre, I don't profess to know what he means, and I shouldn't like to be thought to interpret him. But for my part, I do think the notion of the world having an explanation is a mistake. I don't see why one should expect it to have.
Your general point, then, Lord Russell, is that it's illegitimate even to ask the question of the cause of the world.
That is
yes,
not what
that's
he
my...
said. Oh, but then he agrees. Never mind. I did not think that was what he was saying, but then he says yes.
Position.
Well, if it's a question that for you has no meaning, it's of course very difficult to discuss it, isn't it?
Yes, it is very difficult. What do you say? Shall we pass on to some other issue?
Let's.
Oh man, that was very anticlimactic. It was just, well, you're talking a bunch of nonsense, and well, if I'm talking a bunch of nonsense and you don't understand it, then it's very difficult for us to continue talking about that nonsense, isn't it? Yes, it is. I don't know. I think I've had about enough of this for today. But so thank you to anybody who's Who's watching me? All right, good night.